Hello, and thank you everyone for joining the Mayer Brown Technology Transactions Practice webinar. Our program today will focus on moving ERP systems to the cloud. I'm going to cover a couple of administrative matters and then we'll get started. We will be scheduling periodic calls and webinar programs on technology transaction topics, so watch your inboxes for future invites and feel free to spread the word to others who might be interested. You can also find many past programs on the Technology Transactions webpage at www.mayerbrown.com. Our goal is to provide practical and strategic advice to help you secure high-value technology contracts, improve your operations, build digital platforms, and achieve compliance. During today's presentation, you will be provided with an alphanumeric code. If you're applying for CLE credit, you'll need to record this code on the virtual sign-in sheet that you will have received by email with the connection details. You'll find directions for returning that virtual sign-in sheet on that sheet. We will read the code in the middle of the presentation and again at the end. We plan to allow a few minutes for questions at the end of the program. To submit a question electronically, please use the Q&A panel in WebEx. If we don't get to your question during this webinar, we'll do our best to try to follow up with you after. This webinar is being recorded, as we normally do with these programs. In a day or so, we'll be sending you an email with a link, which you can listen to hear the webinar again or to share with your colleagues. The recording will also be posted to our website. My name is Rebecca Eisner, and I'm happy to participate with my colleague, Marina Aronchik, on today's topic. I'm a partner in the Technology Transactions Practice in the Chicago office of Mayer Brown, and Marina is a senior associate also in the Chicago office of Mayer Brown's Technology Transactions Practice. Our practices focus on data, digital, outsourcing and software, and systems technology transactions. We also cover privacy and cybersecurity matters. Our Tech Trans Practice Group at Mayer Brown has 50 lawyers worldwide who've done over $200 billion of data, digital, outsourcing, and software transactions. We see a high volume of deals, including ERP licensing and cloud deals. And in this presentation today, we'll share some of our collective learning and our experience in this area. So with that brief introduction, let's get started with today's program.
Hi, everyone. Today, we'll discuss 4 key areas. First, we'll highlight short and long-term trends in the space of cloud ERP. We'll then talk about the differences between on-premise ERP and cloud ERP systems. After that, we'll discuss cloud ERP contracts and issues that they present. And finally, we will suggest steps for you to consider as you're preparing for cloud ERP adoption. Let's start with the trends. For context, we'll take a brief look at the evolution of ERP systems. Enterprise Resource Planning, or ERP systems, entered the market around the 1990s. Those systems were transformational because they allowed organizations to integrate disparate existing applications into a single system and then to automate functions and processes through those integrated solutions. Originally, the only way to implement an ERP system was through the on-premises model. In that model, a company was generally implementing and managing an ERP system on its own servers and networks. About 10 years later, so in 2000s, companies started to adopt hosted solutions for ERP systems, where an ERP platform was managed off-site by a third party. The term on-premise that we're using today refers both to this hosted model and the model that we discussed a minute ago, where a company is implementing ERP on its own systems. What we're seeing now is something completely different, which is your organization's going from an on-premises model to a cloud-based ERP solution. In a cloud solution, the platform is both hosted and managed by a third party. It's then generally provided to you as a service through a web browser, subject to certain implementation complexity that we will discuss later in this session. We will refer to this model as cloud ERP. In cloud ERP, some of the larger providers like SAP and Oracle use their own cloud infrastructure. Many of the other providers rely on third-party vendors for hosting services like AWS or Azure. As we will discuss in this session, a complete transformation from on-prem ERP to cloud ERP is quite difficult for most organizations. So they end up with a hybrid ERP model where some ERP software modules or functions are still running on-prem and others are in the cloud. Many businesses today are actively considering or in the process of implementing cloud ERP solutions. The speed with which your organization is moving to cloud ERP depends on a number of factors. One factor is the industry that you're in. Another is how successfully you're using an ERP system today, meaning whether you're getting the functionality that you need out of your current systems. Financial pressure on your business and your IT organization to reduce spend, as well as your organization's risk tolerance, also play a role in the speed with which you move to the cloud. With a caveat for these distinctions, here are the overall predictions by the industry analysts. By 2020, so in a couple of years, 4 of every 10 large organizations will have at least 60% of their ERP applications in the cloud. For your reference, Gartner defines large organizations as those with 1,000 employees and over $1 billion in annual revenue. Half of large enterprises will implement a SaaS strategy for their core ERP in the cloud in the next 7 years, so by 2025. Not surprisingly, the number of organizations pursuing a traditional on-prem ERP strategy will continue to decline. That number is currently at 38%, but Gartner expects that percentage to decrease to about 11% by 2019. As I mentioned earlier, your industry plays a significant role in how quickly you will move to cloud ERP. Gartner believes, and we agree, that the speed with which your organization is making the move depends on whether you're in a product-centric organization or a service-centric organization. A product-centric organization is one that manufactures and sells tangible products. A service-centric organization, on the other hand, is essentially a service company, like a financial institution, a professional or business services firm, or a tech company. Service companies are expected to move to cloud ERP faster than product-centric companies. So for those of you in the service industry, your IT is probably in the process of implementing or is strongly considering cloud ERP solutions today. Analysts think that by 2018, almost a third of service-centric organizations will move the majority of their ERP applications to the cloud. By 2020, 45% of service companies are expected to adopt cloud ERP. Back on the manufacturing side, you're likely further behind the curve on the move. Gartner projects that by 2018, only 5% of large manufacturing companies will deploy complex operational ERP in public cloud. Analysts are expecting manufacturing organizations to reach the 35% mark by 2020. So this means if you're on the product side, you can expect to see a longer lag of about 2 years until you're getting some of those cloud ERP transactions, subject to this exception. In the case of spin-offs, where the entire support system has to be acquired or created by the divested entity, we see many companies go straight to cloud ERP solutions rather than make capital expenditures that are necessary to host ERP systems on-prem. When your organization begins to shift the on-prem ERP to the cloud, that shift will not be uniform. Typically, we see a hybrid approach where some ERP functionality remains on-premises and others hosted in the cloud. One of the main reasons for this is that ERP functions that are important to your business vary. If you're in the service industry, your core ERP functions are likely administrative in nature, such as customer relationship management or CRM, project planning, billing. You may also be using industry-specific functionality. If you're in the product industry, in addition to administrative and industry-specific functionality, your core ERP likely includes operational functions such as demand planning, inventory management, and supply chain. Another reason for the hybrid implementation approach is that a single ERP suite is unlikely to provide all of the necessary functionality. Your organization will likely be using multiple products from different vendors that all require some level of integration. Cloud ERP vendors include some familiar names like Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, Salesforce, and others. But you may also be negotiating with smaller niche providers. Gartner believes there are at least 12 other providers offering core ERP solutions to product-centric, so manufacturing companies. And then there's about a dozen smaller providers focusing on service-centric companies. Even though you will likely be implementing cloud ERP systems through this hybrid or patchwork approach, you should be viewing each component of a cloud ERP transformation in the same manner that you would approach a larger on-prem ERP implementation. You should be thinking about issues and risks that each specific cloud ERP system creates individually as well as holistically for your cloud ERP environment. And now that we've discussed the trends with respect to cloud ERP, Rebecca will talk about the differences between on-prem and cloud ERP solutions.
Thanks, Marina. So we're going to take a look first at a comparison between on-premise and cloud operational considerations, and then we'll move over and talk about some of the differences in risk considerations. So operational considerations. The first one is implementation time. ERP implementations are complex and time-consuming. A lot of organizations that undertake an implementation underestimate the time and the cost involved. An implementation of an on-premise ERP can take anywhere from several months to several years, particularly for complex global rollouts for multinational companies. Cloud implementation takes less time than on-prem, but it still requires careful resource planning, system integration, training, and change management. So it is not as simple as opening an internet browser and simply signing on. Now let's talk about implementation costs. For on-premise ERP, typically your deal has upfront licensing costs as well as hardware costs, and your hardware needs support, professional service costs for implementation and rollout, the change management costs, and ongoing investment in ERP experts. In recent years, you probably saw a change in the hardware cost component if your organization implemented on-premise ERP in a hosted model. This may have changed the hardware portion of the deal, but in any case, on-premise ERP is typically viewed as higher priced, at least up front, than its counterpart in the cloud. Cloud ERP solutions are generally priced on a subscription basis, so there are typically lower upfront costs and no separate hardware costs or costs of maintaining in-house experts to maintain these systems. We do want to note, however, with respect to costs, that even though your upfront costs may be lower with cloud ERP, system costs for cloud and on-prem ERP tend to converge over time, roughly by year 10. Still, if you're testing out a system that will help a particular business unit succeed in today's market with a digital service, your higher cost in 10 years is probably not as significant an issue as an upfront investment would have been. Next, let's talk about customization. With on-prem ERP, organizations have flexibility to customize various modules that will work with the ERP system and to make add-ons and integration changes that allow other legacy systems to work with the on-premise ERP system. When you move to cloud ERP, you lose much of that flexibility. Cloud ERP is a standardized offering. The cloud ERP provider has a one-to-many model, and that means that everything from their development roadmap to the manner in which they host, support, maintain, update, and manage the cloud solution is the same for everyone. Customizations of the cloud solution itself are generally not available. customers must develop APIs and other integration mechanisms outside of the standardized cloud offering. The ability to customize or not has its own advantages and disadvantages. Customized on-prem ERP solutions may fit your particular business needs very well, but they could become expensive to maintain and support in the longer term. The standardized aspect of cloud ERP means that everything from improved functionality to security patching is standard, and all customers receive the benefits of improvements on a much faster time frame than is typically available with on-premise ERP systems. The ongoing costs of maintaining and supporting an on-premise ERP system vary greatly between on-prem and cloud. As mentioned above, on-prem ERP requires an ongoing investment in resources who are familiar with the system and who can maintain and support it over time. There are also infrastructure costs and ongoing capital expenditures to refresh the hardware systems. With cloud ERP, many of these ongoing costs occur on the provider side versus the customer side, and therefore these costs are baked into the subscription fees and the ongoing support fees for the cloud ERP system. Again, because they're a one-to-many standard offering, the costs tend to be lower. However, there may be hidden costs associated with cloud ERP that customers must carefully assess and take into account in their business plans. For example, compliance reporting, audits, managing litigation e-discovery costs, and other similar areas in which customers are dependent on the cloud ERP provider have to be considered in any assessment of the ongoing cost of running an ERP system. A final operational consideration is change control and the ability to control when updates and releases are implemented in the ERP system. With on-premise licensed solutions, typically the customer has control within certain parameters of when to implement software updates, patches, and changes. This is typically really only limited by the period of time in which the licensor will support back versions of the ERP software. This flexibility allows customers to delay making changes during peak business cycles or during other freeze periods in which customers do not want to have to make changes. With cloud ERP, the customer loses the flexibility of determining when changes will occur. Some cloud ERP providers make 2 or more major updates each year. While the cloud customer does not have to worry about implementing those changes because they're done on the cloud provider side, the customer does have to worry about all the integration points and the APIs with the other legacy systems, and whether changes to the cloud ERP system will drive the need for other changes in those integration points, or worse, break them. So cloud ERP providers typically provide some roadmap guidance on when to expect changes and the tentative schedule for implementing them. But this is one of the more important aspects of loss of control when you consider moving from on-premise ERP to cloud ERP. So let's talk now about some of the differences in the risk considerations between on-premise ERP and cloud ERP. And we'll start first with the one that's getting a lot of attention these days, data security. With on-premise ERP, all data is managed in your systems and behind your firewalls. Data and systems are subject to your security policies and controls. With cloud ERP, the provider manages the security of your data and the systems. Now, there's a great debate about whether cloud solutions increase or decrease security risks generally. In theory, cloud providers are in the business of providing not only the service, but also of providing and, importantly, investing in security around the service. So in theory, cloud providers make a greater investment in ensuring the security because security is so critical to their business model and to their success. Therefore, some argue that security protections are greater in the cloud than when a customer is providing for its own systems. But one important thing to note about this theory, because cloud providers are using a one-to-many model, they will have selected security measures and controls that fit a tolerance requirement for the majority of their customers. For a customer that has heightened security needs, for example, if you're in a highly regulated industry or perhaps you're a government contractor, the risk tolerance that's been selected by the cloud provider may not match the regulated requirements that you have as a customer. So customers are always encouraged to do a gap analysis on a cloud provider's security offerings to assess whether there are shortfalls in the security controls and whether the customer is going to be able to mitigate those shortfalls or to accept the risks associated with them. Now let's talk about data locations. With on-premise ERP, the locations of the data centers and the hosting of data are all controlled by the customer within the limits of the license. With cloud ERP, some providers allow a customer to select one or more locations of the instance of the ERP system, as well as one or more primary data locations. However, even in this case, cloud providers often advise customers that their data may be sent anywhere in the world or may be remotely accessed from anywhere in the world. This can happen in connection, for example, with support, maintenance, security troubleshooting, backup, and other similar functions. So customers who are using cloud ERP really need to learn the potential locations of their data and assess the intellectual property, ownership, use, compliance, and regulatory risks associated with those locations. Now let's talk about updates to the ERP systems. As we discussed a little bit on the operational slide, the ability to control the timing of updates and changes to ERP systems allows organizations to better manage the risks associated with those changes. For example, an online retailer would not want to endure major system changes during the busy holiday season, and a provider of tax solutions would certainly not want to endure changes during tax season. Cloud ERP customers lose the ability to manage the timing and therefore must take steps to manage the risks associated with the timing of changes to cloud ERP systems. Now let's talk about competencies, and when we say competencies, we're now talking about people who have knowledge about the systems. With on-premise cloud, customers need to retain resources who are familiar with the systems out of the necessity of keeping them running and keeping them integrated with other systems. With cloud ERP, there is less need to retain people because it's the cloud provider, not the customer, who maintains and supports the cloud solution. However, and this is really a problem with all digital solutions, not just ERP systems, reliance on a cloud provider solution over time results in a loss of institutional knowledge about systems and integration points and general operations. Customers would be well advised to have resources on the customer side who are familiar with the cloud solution, the configuration selections that have been made by the customer, and the material integration points so that customers don't lose complete control and institutional knowledge, or so that customers don't end up with an unmanageable, non-integrated patchwork of digital solutions. This need for retaining knowledge is really one of the hidden costs associated with cloud. Now let's touch briefly on compliance risks. Just like the other risks mentioned above, particularly with data security, when a customer uses cloud ERP, the customer is placing a number of compliance risks into the hands of the cloud provider. These risks include data security, compliance reporting, personnel practices of the cloud provider, meaning do they conduct background screens, the ability to conduct audits and to satisfy regulatory requests for on-site inspections, data breaches, security incident reporting, and a host of other compliance requirements. So it will be important to take these risks into consideration in your contract with a cloud ERP provider. And finally, we have performance risks. Customers who implement on-premise solutions have a lot of control over the ability to architect the level of performance, redundancy, and flexibility that they want in their ERP system. With cloud, customers have to accept the service levels offered by the cloud provider, the maintenance windows, and many other performance-impacting choices made by the cloud provider, with little or no ability to manage these performance measures by the customer. So, as you can see, There are a number of trade-offs and considerations for customers to evaluate in determining whether to use an on-premise ERP solution or a cloud solution or a hybrid of the two. These factors that we've just discussed on the operational risks and the other risk considerations will drive your strategy as you consider moving from on-premise ERP to the cloud. The need to preserve flexibility and control for portions of an on-premise ERP solution is one of the reasons why a lot of companies do use the hybrid approach in migrating portions of their ERP system to a cloud, but not everything. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about cloud ERP contracts and the issues that they present. Marina?
Thanks, Rebecca. So because there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to the move from on-premise ERP to the cloud, there is a variety of contracting structures for cloud ERP deals. One potential structure is where you're contracting for additional scope, meaning new scope that is not part of your existing ERP system. Another possibility that we discussed earlier is the hybrid approach. Again, in a hybrid model, you're moving a portion of your existing ERP functionality to the cloud and retaining some of it on-prem. It's also possible that you're contracting to move the entire existing ERP scope to the cloud. But due to the complexities associated with this approach, we think this contracting model is less likely, at least at the moment. In all of these contracting structures, agreements for cloud ERP are typically done on provider paper, and those terms, of course, tend to be favorable to the provider. Across the range of various providers, these forms, however, typically raise similar substantive issues. And it's important to know both that you can negotiate these terms and also what the reasonable range of outcome is and that you can expect from these negotiations. Substantive issues in cloud ERP deals generally fall in two categories. The first set of issues are the same types of issues that came up in on-prem ERP deals. We will first focus on those. And the second set of issues that we'll talk about later are new issues that are unique to the cloud. So the first issue that you probably encountered in on-prem ERP deals and that you will need to work through for cloud ERP is the definition of use. Your organization's employees need the right to remotely access and use the cloud ERP system by logging into it. But the definition of use also needs to be broad enough to cover the following additional types of access and use to your cloud ERP. You need an express right to implement and configure the cloud ERP system. You also need the right for your extended enterprise to access cloud ERP, either directly or indirectly to the extent needed. Your extended enterprise may include your third-party contractors, consultants, and sometimes suppliers or similar third parties that are doing business with your organization. You also need the right for you to use cloud ERP for acquired and divested businesses. For divestitures, you can limit the duration of permitted use to some reasonable period, like 6 or 12 months post-close. While you need the concept of use to be broad enough to cover all of your potential types of access to cloud ERP, you should note that some providers may require that you take responsibility for actions of your users. So from the operational perspective, you do not want to be granting access to the cloud ERP system beyond the truly needed scope. Next, definitions of users and metrics. As we discussed earlier, upfront licensing costs are a large pricing component in an on-prem ERP deal. But cloud ERP solutions are generally priced on subscription or consumption basis with lower upfront costs. In both models, the license or subscription fees are based on your level of use of the ERP solution. So it's important to clearly define your usage metrics in the contracts, and you need to describe the mechanism by which these metrics are counted. You need to be clear on what types of use triggers or does not trigger subscription fees in cloud ERP. You also need to address your right to replace former users with new ones and to add additional users. If you're moving on-prem ERP to a cloud solution with the same provider, you should also consider the following issue. You really need a mechanism that allows you to reduce use under the on-prem license, leading to lower ongoing use fees and the maintenance costs in exchange for subscription fees that you would be now paying on the cloud side. And of course, we can talk about defining use and users without also mentioning indirect use. Similar to on-premise deals, for cloud ERP, you need to consider whether subscription fees apply to users of external systems that are connected to your cloud ERP, whether that's through APIs or similar means. What about the customers who may be benefiting from the cloud ERP system by placing orders that you process through cloud ERP? Would they require subscription fees? And also, what subscription fees would apply to their use? There is a similar question with respect to uploading of data to the cloud ERP system, extracting data from that system, and processing it through other tools. You need to carefully consider all of these scenarios when you're determining the likely fees for cloud ERP. And ideally, you would address these issues with clarity in your contract in order to mitigate the risk of unanticipated subscription fees. To provide some color to the issue of indirect use and the importance of defining use and users, we will highlight last year's Diageo versus SAP case. But please note, though, that these types of issues are not limited to SAP. For context, Diageo is a British company in the beverage industry. In 2004, they licensed an SAP ERP system where the license fees were calculated based on the number of named users. They also licensed related software engines that allow Diageo's third-party systems to interact with the ERP system. At issue in the case were two Salesforce.com-based systems that connected to Diageo's ERP system. The first one was used by Diageo sales reps, and the other by Diageo customers and distributors in order to place orders through an online portal. This case raised multiple issues, but the key one was whether Diageo owed additional license and maintenance fees for use of the ERP system through these two Salesforce.com-based systems. The other issues were whether Diageo infringed SAP's intellectual property based on their use of these systems, and also whether SAP was entitled to an injunction in order to conduct an audit. The IP infringement and audit claims did not get very far, but the issue of additional fees did. The court determined that the named user licenses were the only basis on which Diageo had the right to use the SAP ERP system, and that all of the users of Salesforce.com-based systems did access the ERP system. So therefore, all of these users, meaning Diageo sales reps, customers, and distributors, needed named user licenses. The court did not determine the amount there, but the amount that SAP was seeking was £54 million. Again, we highlight this case because the way in which Diageo used SAP and Salesforce.com-based systems is very common, and this type of use is not confined to those specific systems. In fact, as the number of ERP providers increases and the value of data processed through the systems becomes of growing importance, you're more likely to see your businesses looking to connect various systems with ERP and to aggregate and analyze the data that these systems process. It's critical that your pricing mechanisms for cloud ERP systems take into account both potential legacy and direct use issues with respect to on-prem system, like the one that we saw in Diageo, and also address indirect use issues in your cloud ERP contracts going forward. You should also keep in mind one important distinction between cloud ERP and its on-prem counterpart. The visibility that a cloud provider has into your usage of cloud ERP is much greater than what an on-prem provider would have. Your on-prem provider typically relies on its audit rights to determine whether you're within your licensed use metrics. These generally tend to be annual audits, but that might vary. A cloud provider, on the other hand, can, at least from the technical perspective, remotely monitor your logins into cloud ERP, the connections between ERP and other systems, and the data flows between these systems. This modern capability makes it significantly more likely that if you exceed your license level of use, the supplier will be quick to seek corresponding additional fees. They would not have to wait for an annual or even less frequent audit in order to recover those fees. But this type of access with a cloud provider should also make it easier for you, at least in theory, to limit your exposure by making payment of additional license fees to the provider, the sole and exclusive remedy. You may also be limited to limit or negotiate out any on-prem audit rights that the supplier may be seeking. It would also be reasonable to limit retroactive applicability of any additional fees to a specified period. For example, the supplier may go back 1 year, but not any longer. Again, given the risk of disputes on the calculation of license fees for direct and indirect use of cloud ERP systems, it remains important for you to negotiate the right to withhold disputed fees pending resolution of a dispute. For example, before you pay additional fees based on your excess use, you may want to understand the tool that the supplier is using to determine such use and ask for an explanation of the results that the tool provided. If you are required to pay disputed fees, and even under protest, the supplier would have much less of an incentive to provide visibility to you on the calculation of these additional subscription fees. Of course, use is not the only issue. On this slide, we'll highlight a number of other issues that arise in both on-prem and cloud ERP deals. First, indemnification. The principle here remains that your vendor should be responsible for claims resulting from its failures and actions. So you would want to make sure that you're protected against third-party claims relating to things like confidentiality breaches, IP infringement, and suppliers' failure to comply with laws. You also need to make sure that liability limits and, importantly, the carve-outs are appropriate based on the solution that the vendor is providing. As we talked about earlier, data security and data privacy tend to be the more controversial points, and that includes indemnities and limits of liability. This will likely continue to be a challenging area, and you need to think carefully about the types of data that you will be hosting, whether it's U.S. or European data, as well as corresponding risks, particularly in light of the GDPR in Europe. It also remains important, if not more important, to limit your vendor's termination rates. Ideally, the only basis for your vendor's termination would be your non-payment of material undisputed amounts. We strongly recommend addressing contested terminations. So if your vendor invokes a termination provision and you contest the validity of such termination, the contract would require the vendor to continue to provide and give you the right to continue to receive services until the issue of validity of termination is resolved, whether in arbitration or in court, depending on your dispute resolution mechanism. You also need to have thoughtful provision around disengagement services. Cloud ERP providers tend to say the termination assistance is limited to them providing data back to you, but as you start to think about the process for migration to the cloud and the various integrations and configurations that were needed in order to make the cloud system meet your unique requirements, you'll quickly realize that there are many other complexities associated with moving away from the cloud ERP system. We had said earlier that one of the advantages of cloud ERP is that you would no longer need to retain in-house ERP subject matter experts. Well, with that loss of expertise, you may also need to retain outside consultants to assist you with transition. To do that properly, you may need to perform knowledge transfer from your existing provider to understand how the cloud system is set up and configured and appropriately schedule your data migration. It's therefore important to negotiate a comprehensive disengagement services provision in order to give you flexibility to switch providers while mitigating the risk on your operations. And now that we've discussed key issues that arise both on on-prem and cloud ERP systems, Rebecca will talk about the issues that are unique to cloud ERP contracts.
Thanks, Marina. So as Marina just said, we've been going over issues that on-premise ERP systems and cloud ERP systems have in common. And now we're going to focus on issues that are truly unique just to cloud ERP systems. And we're putting these into 3 buckets. So first we will talk about service-related issues. Then we'll talk about flexibility and the ability to transition away from a cloud ERP provider. And finally, we'll come back to that favorite, data security and data privacy. So with respect to the service-related issues, first on our list of issues that are unique to cloud ERP is protection against the vendor having the right to unilaterally change the terms of service. We call this floating terms. From the customer standpoint, it's quite unsettling that a provider could unilaterally change important terms in your agreement. And yet, floating terms have really become a standard part of not only cloud ERP, but cloud in general. There are some mitigating approaches that customers can consider, and the likelihood of negotiating one of these approaches really depends on the cloud provider. From a customer standpoint, the best approach is to lock down the terms that sit behind those URL links after a careful review and negotiation of them by the customer. So they become an attachment to the agreement and they would not be subject to change, at least for this particular customer. Some cloud providers are willing to take this approach. Sometimes they take it with the caveat that upon a renewal, the new updated terms will apply. Another way to address the issue of floating terms is to use an order of precedence clause in which material terms in the master agreement will always take precedence or govern over terms that conflict in lower priority documents. And we would include in those lower priority documents these floating terms. In the event of a conflict between the higher level document and the lower level document, the higher level document or the protected clause would apply. This precedence clause might even be expanded to include what we call a knockout component. And a knockout component would say that certain terms and conditions are off limits for change. So, for example, a knockout clause might say that all termination rights are only to be set forth in the master agreement, and any new rights to terminate in any updated floating terms would be void and of no effect for that customer. Even if the customer doesn't succeed in negotiating a knockout clause, you will certainly need to include an order of precedence clause that clearly identifies which documents govern over the others as part of the entire cloud contracting stack. This is because cloud contracts do tend to be made up of a stack of documents that include everything from master agreements to schedules, service descriptions, acceptable use policies, security documents, data protection agreements, and lots of floating URL terms that all together make up the agreement. Customers need to consider that an order of precedence clause may be helpful, but it likely will not fully eliminate all risks around lower priority documents, especially if something comes into those lower priority documents that doesn't directly conflict with something in the higher priority controlling documents. For example, service descriptions and URL terms that are floating may introduce new storage or use requirements, and if those requirements are not specifically addressed in the higher level documents, then those new terms in the lower level documents may become applicable. Now let's talk about SLAs for a minute. You also need to make sure that your vendor is subject to meaningful SLA commitments and that there are meaningful penalties for failing to meet those commitments. Even if the amounts at risk seem meaningful, the process for receiving credits can't be so cumbersome that in reality you really don't have SLA penalties to rely on at all. Suspension is another area that's unique to cloud ERP and isn't present when you are managing your ERP system on-prem. Vendors often seek rights to suspend delivery of the services, and it's critical to limit suspension rights narrowly. You want to limit them in scope, and you want to limit them in duration. Suspension of cloud ERP service is likely to have a very bad impact on your organization. If you do have to give the vendor the right to suspend, you should require prompt reinstatement of the service as soon as the relevant issue is resolved. staying with our category of service-related issues, in areas where there are changes to the services are acceptable, and remember, evolution and ready access to new technology is one of the advantages of cloud ERP as compared to an on-premise solution. Cloud ERP customers ideally will receive advance notice of changes to services, as well as protection against disruptive changes. Note that maintenance and support agreements for cloud ERP tend to be lighter commitments than those for support of on-premise licensed ERP software. Technical and business teams should carefully review the maintenance and support terms to ensure that they'll meet your business's needs. And these also tend to be floating terms. Cloud providers typically subcontract some functions to affiliates or third parties. When licensing on-premise ERP software, the concept of subcontractors is only relevant to the maintenance and support and the implementation obligations. But in a cloud context, the use of subcontractors is relevant to the provision of the entire service, and so it becomes a far more important issue. Cloud providers typically will not allow customers to have prior approval over subcontractors. However, they often will disclose who the subcontractors and affiliates are, the functions that they perform, and often they will allow customers an opportunity to object to a new subcontractor for reasonable objections. In that case, the cloud provider may agree to discuss concerns with the customer, but ultimately, the customer may have to accept the subcontractor or use the remedy of terminating the services. With respect to subcontractors who are handling personal data that's subject to EU regulation, which are called subprocessors, the cloud provider has certain obligations as a data processor to obtain the customer's consent to subcontracting, as well as to keep the customer advised as to who the subprocessors are and to keep that list up to date. Other obligations regarding subcontracting apply in the context of EU data, so customers should really take legal counsel in this area. A more difficult issue with respect to subcontracting is when a cloud provider utilizes a different cloud platform provider to host the cloud application, and that platform provider has offered less favorable terms to the cloud solution provider. Now, being on the customer side of most of the consultation that we do, we frequently counsel customers that this is really an issue for the cloud provider and not for the customer. So a cloud provider should not be permitted to disclaim liability for or reduce protections around the cloud platform provider. After all, it was the cloud solution provider who selected the cloud platform provider, and that cloud solution provider should therefore take the risk around it. That choice should not lead to an unreasonable shifting of risk to the customer due to a choice made by the cloud provider, particularly where the customer does not have contractual remedies against the platform provider. Marina gave some examples of these platform providers earlier in the presentation, including AWS and Microsoft Azure, for example. Finally, cloud provider warranties tend to be weaker than those traditionally available in an on-premise software ERP license. A typical ERP software license has warranties related to performance of the software in accordance with the specifications and performance standards for professional services, including maintenance and support, as well as some other warranties, such as compliance with laws. Many cloud service providers have seen fit not to carry over those same related concepts when they created their cloud services, and often customers have to negotiate these back into a cloud ERP agreement. Now, moving to the second bucket. These are points really dealing with flexibility and the ability to migrate away from cloud services, and Marina addressed some of these concepts earlier in her comments, so we won't spend a lot of time on them right now. But as we talked about earlier, and as a reminder, it's important to negotiate the following protections in your cloud ERP agreement. First, you want to make sure you have a right to regular and frequent extraction of ERP data for use in other customer systems. Next, you want to talk about your rights to renew the services. The terms for ERP cloud agreements tend to be far shorter than on-premise license agreements, and so you want to think about the cycles of time in which you want your term of services to run and how many renewal options you'd like to have. Your right to transition assistance from the vendor prior to the termination of the cloud services is very important, and often that means you need to work in the rights to continue use of the system, including with maintenance and support, during a reasonable period of time, which is often up to a 12-month period. And moving to the last bucket, but not the least, as we've already talked a little bit about data security, cybersecurity, and data privacy. As we mentioned earlier, these points tend to be difficult negotiation points with respect to indemnities and limits of liability. But as a customer, you need to remember that in order to hold your vendor responsible for a breach, your contract needs to include adequate commitments by your vendor in these areas. These protections should be in addition to the customary protections of confidentiality of company and personal data that we typically see in most agreements. You also want to address vendor data use, such as their rights to conduct analytics on your data and whether or not you're comfortable with your cloud provider using your data on an anonymous basis. It's also critical to address vendor locations for data processing and storage for visibility purposes, but also because different locations create compliance issues, as we previously referenced. And of course, you want to include provisions that require your provider to comply with laws. So addressing these contracting issues around service-related issues and to provide flexibility, as well as to cover security and data privacy concerns, will help a customer to realize the full benefits of moving your ERP systems to the cloud. Marina?
We'll spend these last few minutes on a few steps that we would like to suggest for your consideration as you're preparing to adopt and implement the cloud. We'll first talk about the suggested steps if you're moving from on-prem to the cloud with the same provider. In this scenario, you'll need to carefully review your existing on-prem contract. You may be able to leverage favorable terms from that contract into your cloud contract. Or if you're unable to do that, you would also be in a good position to help your business team understand the differences in the contract terms from the operational and risk perspectives. This is an important consideration, particularly if you're considering multiple vendors or if you have flexibility on the portions of ERP that you're moving to the cloud. You also need to identify terms that need improvement in your current on-prem agreements. As the on-prem ERP market is shrinking, the providers are trying to protect revenue by converting current on-prem customers to become cloud customers. So you may be able to extract some value out of that process, both with respect to the cloud contract and your existing on-prem terms. You should also define a so-called conversion mechanism. You may be able to exchange some of the perpetual on-prem licenses for cloud subscriptions either now or in the future, and you should negotiate a mechanism for doing that in your cloud agreement. Also, one of the fundamental assumptions for your organization's move is likely that your spend under the on-prem contract will decrease by some amount, ideally an amount that at least corresponds to the new spend for cloud ERP. So you need to make sure that your on-prem contract actually allows you to reduce spend in this manner, perhaps by eliminating certain users or otherwise decreasing support and maintenance costs.
So if you are moving from your on-premise cloud provider to a different cloud provider, there are a couple of steps that you should consider to prepare. First, you need to carefully evaluate your existing on-prem agreement, determine any costs or other impacts that you'll incur from winding down your use and moving to the cloud, such as minimum revenue commitments, payments in advance with no refund, or other forfeiture-type clauses. Second, you'll need to ensure that you have enough runway time left in your on-premise agreement and some cushion to allow for the transition from on-premise to the replacement cloud provider. And third, if you're shifting on-prem scope to the cloud, reducing spend and engaging a different cloud provider, there is a possibility that your current provider will seek to protect its revenue by auditing your on-premise license use or try to create other incentives to prevent a move. So you need to be prepared for these types of maneuvers and consider the risk of claims of extra use, as Marina described earlier with the Diageo case, and the likelihood of a retroactive audit by your existing cloud provider. You may want to consider negotiating a settlement and a waiver of the license fees for overusage that may have occurred before you really begin moving your system to the cloud. And I think in the interest of time, we will likely skip this last slide, but you will be able to see the content of it when you receive the copy of the presentation and the link that we will send out. It looks like we have maybe just a minute or two for any questions that any of you may have sent to us. And we did get a question about whether attendees today will get copies of materials, and you will receive a copy of the presentation and the recording within the next 24 to 48 hours. So with that, we want to thank you for listening today. It was our pleasure to talk to you about moving ERP to the cloud, and please be on the lookout for future invitations to Mayor Brown's Technology Transactions webinar series. Thank you for listening in.